What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 644. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. And joining me on the line, probably a mile from me, 2 miles away, it's our special guest host for this week. It's TBS, the Ben Seck is back on the show. Luis is out of town for work. He's actually down in the Bahamas, and so he took the week off. And we've got TBS. TBS, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me back, Marshall. It's always great to be part of the show. I mean, usually I get to insult Luis while he's here, but today all the barbs are going to be targeted at you.
Oh, come on! I was just going to say the best thing about insulting Luis is when he's not here. Because, he doesn't listen to the show. He refuses to listen to any podcast ever. And that means we just have free reign and nobody gets to know. So
well, I'll make sure there's a lot of Luis barbs, and hopefully,
yes.
If at the end he actually hears any of them, it'll be all worth it too.
That's right. They trickle over. Gloves off, TBS. You have free reign here. Yeah, we brought in TBS for the show. We're going to talk about the OP changes that we touched on last week with Luis, but we're going to go much deeper on them, about the changes in general for competitive players, because this is a podcast that is, most of our audience considers themselves competitive players. So it's certainly going to be relevant for them coming up. And I wanted to go a little deeper on it because I think it's an interesting topic that has big ramifications for our audience. We're also going to go deep on Limited's place in Magic, and particularly in the competitive scene, kind of over the years. And TBS is perfectly suited for this. We'll talk about that when we get into the main topic. Before we do, let's mention our sponsors. First up is channelfireball.com. Make sure you check them out for really anything that you need Magic related. If you want to head over to Channel Fireball, you got a really good chance of finding it. Sealed product if you need to get some Neon Dynasty booster boxes to fire off some drafts with your friends. Something, fill out a commander deck or, pioneer deck. There's a bunch of formats that have been kind of rejuvenated with the OP announcement. As we're starting to see what formats they're focusing on. And of course, you're going to need cards and decks to play those. Channel Fireball is a great place to do it. They have a marketplace now where before you would go and see what Channel Fireball's inventory was. And while they did have a very large inventory, sometimes they'd not have a card in stock, or maybe, you'd want one in like a very specific condition and they wouldn't have it. Now, stores can sell their cards through the Channel Fireball marketplace. So you get access to a huge range of selection, which can let you dial it down to exactly what you want. Some people don't care about condition very much. As long as it's legal, throw it in a sleeve and you can save a few bucks, and they'll do that. Other people like to get cards that are absolutely minty fresh and they want to keep them that way. You can choose by visiting the Channel Fireball marketplace. If you do head over there, if you use the affiliate code LR at the checkout, it helps us out and we do appreciate it. The show's also brought to you by FTX. It's a place to manage all of your digital assets. They are a hub of sorts, right? They're the place you go to buy, sell, and trade any type of digital asset. So if you're looking to dip your toe into that space, there's no rush. If you want to take your time, learn about it, and really kind of dive in, you should do that. It's when you're ready. That's when FTX says, hey, we want to be the place that you go to when you decide that you're ready to try your hand at this market. There's ftx.us for US-based customers and ftx.com for outside of the US. And you can check it out for information and to get onboarded there. I do want to remind you, if you do decide to check out FTX or honestly any other site like this, you want to make sure that you consult an investment professional first, because this is a form of investment. There is risk, and you really need to understand the risk that you're taking before you take an endeavor like this. But like I said, when you're ready, ftx.com outside the US, ftx.us within. The show's also brought to you by you via the Patreon. And this, of course, is where you can come to support the show directly. This gives you access to the Patreon question of the week threads, to the Q&A episodes, all of that kind of stuff, as well as a thank you card and an LR sticker that you can throw on your laptop or your water bottle or car or whatever in the mail. That's for any level, by the way. Like, we don't, if you sign up for the Patreon, you're getting one of those things. No question about it. So that's great. And you can, of course, get some extra cool perks as you kind of work your way up. We want to thank everybody over on the Patreon for supporting us. We really, really do appreciate it. Let's see. We will skip the Patreon question of the week for this week because I do want to get into the Crack-A-Pack and then into our discussion with TBS. So we're going to go right into the Crack-A-Pack here. This, of course, is a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Crack-A-Pack. Our first card out. Uh-oh. TBS, our first card out's actually strangely one of the most controversial cards in the set, and it's a basic swamp, which is kind of funny, but the artwork has a lot of red tones to it. It's a red lantern, which, as far as I understand, has cultural relevance in Japan, the red lantern specifically. So this was taken as a cultural reference from modern day Japan, even though this, of course, takes place far into the future. The only which is, it's actually really cool artwork. It's just, it triggers your brain to think of red, which makes you think of mountain. Kind of unfortunate there.
It's cool. I love the design of these lands in general. I do think that they probably could have avoided it by like asking the artist not to put something red.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's of course not going to be our pick. Our first comment is befriending the moths. One of the few sagas that I'm not actually a particular fan of. I'll play it. It's not unplayable by any stretch, but this isn't one that I ever prioritize, where most of the sagas I do.
Yeah, this one's like totally kind of like C- kind of territory kind of card.
Yes.
Like the biggest reason is that the creature at the end of it is just not that impressive.
Right. It's just a medium creature at the end. And, it also does select for situations where you're either at parity or are ahead, and it can definitely close out a game. But when you're behind and you go 4 mana, like that's a really tough pill to swallow. Where most of the other ones do at least something. Like even Scry to try to set up my next draw step would be something, right? Gain a little life, of course, doing anything that affects the board is where you want to be there. Next is Return to Action. This is the 1 in a black instant. Till end of turn, target creature gets +1/+0 and lifelink. And when this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. It just never can seem to find room for cards like this.
No, I haven't liked it. I've liked it that this kind of effect in other sets, but not this one.
Yeah, I think it's particularly out of place here. A lot of the ninjas have triggered abilities that when they hit your opponent rather than entering the battlefield. So that kind of stops it. Of course, you do get some extra value from sagas potentially, but it just doesn't seem to come together often enough. Tawashi Song Shaper, this is the DJ, the 2/2 for 1 in a red. Card's gone down a ton. Never really had it that high, and now I have it, firmly in the like D category.
Yeah, it's marginal in the red-black deck. It's fine in that deck, but that's pretty much the only deck that it's worth playing.
What about Planar Incision? This is the 1 in a red or 1 in a blue instant. Exile target artifact or creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it.
I generally think this is a fine sideboard card if there's a lot of like reasonable removal that your opponent has. Mm-hmm. If you're playing best of 1 queues, it's just not quite high enough impact or as flexible as you need it to be. It's not terrible. It's just
it really isn't terrible. Yeah.
Just not quite like it doesn't deserve a slot.
It does not deserve a slot. It is another D. Again, we categorize those as you'd prefer not to, but you do play them sometimes. They D's make the cut, right? It's not like it's a trash card. It's just when you play one. Voltage Surge, this is one of the cards that's gone down the most for me. Very powerful card, but being in red really hurts it for me. Like when I see a Voltage Surge pack on pick 1 early in the set, I'd be like, that's on my short list, and now I don't even consider it.
I have a pretty soft spot for the artifact decks. I totally agree that red is kind of not as good as you'd hoped, but in the decks that you actually play red, but the black red and sometimes the blue red decks, this is actually a pretty good card. So I want to kind of like be very clear. If you happen to have those decks, this card is this is a very reasonable card in your deck. It's like a C+ kind of, or maybe a B- card.
Yeah.
But it's flexibility in like being in multiple decks Like it just doesn't fit in a lot of decks. It's not that great in a red-white deck. It's not that great in a red-green deck. And so that's the reason. Like it's actually quite a narrow card because it only shines in those artifact decks. I love it, sacrificing an experimental synthesizer.
Oh yeah.
It's always nice to kind of have that sacrifice effect for very cheap. But I agree, it's not something you want to first pick.
Right. Mukotai Ambusher. This is the 3/2 lifelink. Good card. I play it.
Yeah. It's totally fine. There are a lot of better ninjas, but it does help you win a race sometimes, and that sometimes the ninja battle does get down to that.
Sky Swimmer Koi.
I'm so medium in this card.
Me too.
It's
same.
It like early on I was like, oh, this is fine. Like, it's a phantom monster with upside, but actually it's just not impactful enough. I don't know. Just like has a lot of trouble with reach creatures. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of reach in this set, and I feel like I just never kind of get through with this thing.
Yeah, it's interesting too because you'd think it'd be a pretty easy inclusion in an artifact deck because of the triggered ability, but I almost always would rather just have this be another artifact, right? Like you do. There are many artifact decks that need to maximize on them, and this isn't one. There's only so many payoffs you can have, and this is a mediocre payoff.
Just a little thing here is like the best blue decks are ninja decks for the most part.
Yeah.
And you hate ninjaing things that cost more, like a lot.
Definitely.
And so it's just so slow to replay this card.
Totally. And with no ETB, and then on top of it, if you ninja Mukotai Ambusher off of it, you don't get the trigger. It's just like, I don't know, not a fan. Seven Tail Mentor. This one is similar, just doesn't really see much play. It's the 2/3 for 3 and a white, and you get a +1/+1 counter on a creature vehicle when it ETBs. I mean, or dies. It's these are the reality checks of cards. Like these last two cards that we just named, they're both really solid Magic cards, and they just don't quite make the cut in a synergy-based deck.
Yeah, but and synergy-based decks are really what this set is about.
Yeah,
and what modern kind of limited is about. I think synergy decks are much better generally.
Yeah,
and so these cards just don't quite cut it.
Right, because raw power level, these are fine. I mean, geez,
they're fine.
Yeah, Grafted Growth is next. That's the enchant land. You get a counter on a creature, and the land taps for double mana.
So I just want to kind of refer to something that happened last week. I was listening to the podcast, and someone was asking about like, are 4 and 5 color decks kind of becoming more popular? And I actually think towards the end of a cycle of a set, multicolored decks become better as people understand the pick orders better, and like you kind of get, for want of a better word, jankier decks because you don't get as many kind of like freebies. And so what that's why multicolored decks are kind of better, because like good drafters can kind of like get out of a bad seat by just drafting like better colors over better cards over more colors.
Right.
And so that's why you actually get like 3, 4, 5 color decks towards the end of a set, and they get better because people know the synergistic like pick orders much better.
Yeah.
And so you don't get those cheap freebies that you normally would at the beginning of a set. So
that's interesting.
I think this card goes up as like in kind of the late Kamigawa draft.
Plus people get bored.
Well, that's true too.
Right. They're just like, screw it, I'll just draft whatever. Last comment is Fade into Antiquity.
This is a medium card that kind of always makes your deck.
Yeah.
I have no problem having one of these in my deck. It's a sorcery. You very rarely get like super amounts of value out of it, but it's not. You'll have a target all the time.
Gotta have it. Yeah, exactly. What would you do? Those are the commons. This pack sucks. I would look at Fade, Grafted Growth, or Voltage Surge. Like,
I mean, I love like the 4 and 5 color decks. So I'll take Grafted Growth, though I don't think I'm not happy about it at all.
I like that. I think I would be on Fade at this point. Our uncommons, first one, so much potential, but Acquisition Octopus.
This is kind of a win more card. If you have it set up for like if you have a deck that like, or if you have a draw that this card is good, it's over. But
yes,
it actually doesn't come up that often because it doesn't have evasion, and then you've got to equip it to an evasive creature, but then you already got an evasive creature. It's fun. This card is actually probably better than any of the commons, but it's also, it's still a C.
Yeah, it's just it just the fact that it's clunky, right? A 2/2 for 3 is really unacceptable in limited these days. Like, you can't just run those out and expect to win.
Yep.
And then the equip cost is, or whatever it's called, reconfigure cost is 2, that's what it should be. But it's hard to set up scenarios where you repeatedly have clean attacks in the format. Next is, getting that hot tub, invigorating hot spring.
I think this card is the biggest upside of the cards we've had before. While Gruul colors aren't particularly great in Kamigawa block, this card is really, really good.
This card's awesome.
Like, it's just super powerful. And if you already have kind of a +1/+1 counter theme going, it's super powerful to have the haste stuff.
Yes.
4 counters is a lot too.
It is.
There's a lot of counters.
And it gives you a lot of flexibility too. But to me, it's just, you have to splash. Like, I'm not playing red-green in this format. Like, I just will not do it. So that's a little tough. Essence Captures next. No. Our rare, Thousand Face Shadow. This is an interesting one to talk about. This is the blue 1/1 flying ninja. It has ninjutsu for 2 blue. And it says, when it enters the battlefield from your hand, so basically when you ninjutsu it, if it's attacking, which it would be if you did, create a token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking.
Yeah.
The way I view this card generally is 1/1 flyer for 1, so that I can enable other ninjutsu things, and then maybe I get to activate the whole thing once.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is actually comes up as pretty not often, and often it's kind of awkward because the card that you want to copy is the card that gets is the card that gets through.
Yes,
like that happens a lot. I think you should think of this much more as the ninja enabler than the special ability, and then at that point you might as well have the artifact 1/1 flyer. And I think that card is actually better than that.
They're very, very close, right? Like, this one does have a higher ceiling, but the floor is higher on the, whatever it's called, acquisition, whatever, the 1/1 flyer. All right. So what do you want to take here?
I mean, I would take Hot Spring because I love the upside of that. Again, you're totally right. This is a splash card. I'd want to play it in a 3 or 4 or 5 color deck. And then second would be Grafted Growth. I mean, again, my push is generally to, like right now, it's a decks that can be kind of fun and play a lot of stuff. And I actually think they're very, very powerful right now. Yeah,
I think I would narrow down to Grafted Growth and Fade into Antiquity, and probably would take Fade. Like, I'm just picturing myself in the seat right now and just saying, well, what would I actually take if I was drafting? I think I would take Fade, which I'm not really happy about. Like, that's pretty crappy pack. Okay, let's get into this discussion because, we had this huge headlining thing. We outlined it last week on the show about the organized play changes at the highest level from Wizards of the Coast. And, there's, I think, 2 broad discussions to be had here. And the reason that I wanted to talk to TBS about this specifically is because, TBS, you somehow have managed to straddle the line between somebody who partakes in organized play, but also your career has led you down paths that's given you that other perspective of what it's like to be on the company side of an organized play or a big picture view of a game, right?
Yeah. So I'll just give a little bit of background so you can kind of understand the context.
That'd be great.
I as a player, I've been playing like essentially since Legends and Revise at that time, and I've played literally every like major set since then. Like, I've always
played not missed a set.
Not like a lot of people take kind of breaks in the middle. I've actually played continuously for like almost 30 years. I think it's like 28 years.
That's incredible.
I mean, I've loved Magic since the first kind of starter and booster I opened, and it's just been a big part of my life. And in fact, I mean, I owe getting into gaming and game design from Magic. So to give a little context to my kind of like work side, I've been a game designer for over 20 years, and I've worked as both a paper and cardboard kind of game designer, as well as a digital game designer in more recent times. I used to work at Upper Deck. They were like known for like World of Warcraft TCG. I made some cards for there, and then Versus as well. And they've had OP systems there. And now I actually am a creative director for digital games, and so I understand kind of like the balancing you need to do to kind of like make sure that digital game offerings are actually competitive with other kind of internet experiences. Because the one thing that I think a lot of people forget is that digital gaming kind of like coexists in the space where with like video streaming, other like social media. So you actually have to make sure that you're competitive with all the other entertainment kind of things that happen on the internet, because that's kind of what you could be doing otherwise. So I mean, that's a little bit.
So like if you were to think about, because I want to touch on this, because that's really interesting to me. The perspective being before, if it's a tabletop game, let's say you would go to the game store to play it, it would be you're competing with the stuff on the shelf, right? Like I can grab this game or this game. But what you're saying is if you're in the digital gaming space, you have to compete with everything that I can find on my computer, basically. Like if I turn on my computer and I sit down and I stare at the screen, right? I can look and I can go onto a web browser that can find literally anything on the internet. And I can go onto a few different gaming portals like Steam or Epic or whatever, and I can pick from the games there. And I may even just have all of those.
Yep.
So, but you're also saying I can also open up Netflix and I can watch. I can open up YouTube and watch incredibly well-made watch repair videos, for example. Or I can get on Twitter and argue with somebody about politics. Or I can waste 3 hours on Facebook, just down the line. Yep. All of these things, and you're competing with all of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the context is that gaming used to be an enthusiast kind of hobby, and what I mean by that is like the people that actually walk into a game store are already primed to want to play games. It's much rarer for someone to go into a game store kind of like randomly.
Right.
Now we've moved to a world of like a lot of kind of like, light interaction to super heavy interaction. And so you actually have to like have products that actually like satisfy customers from that light interaction, as in someone who wants to play for 5 minutes to someone who wants to like dedicate their life to it. And you have to, and it's much, much harder to build experiences to kind of like straddle that entire gamut. And that's why Magic has felt a little stretched in recent years, because it used to be able to be very focused at what it was trying to do and the audience it was trying to get. And honestly, that audience wasn't very inclusive. I mean, there's a reason why Magic, predominantly was played by kind of younger male identifying players. And now, like, because you have to compete with a lot of other entertainment things, you need a wider audience. And so therefore, it needs to and should be more inclusive and have a bigger audience and like have people who want to be casual as well as all the way to like, people who make their livelihood this game.
And so you're saying the pressures on a game company to keep up with all of these other things means that, like, would you categorize them as having focused on the player type of competitive player before? Like traditionally?
Absolutely. And like the Pro Tour and even just OP in general could be targeted better because the types and number of players was smaller. And now as you kind of like want OP to kind of like satisfy so many different types of players, this is the problem that we're facing. And this is why like a lot of people are predicting an OP system that no one would be satisfied by. And honestly, I don't want to like, I think Wizards in general could have done a lot of things better, but this is a very, very like difficult and tough nut to crack and get correct. And while I think they were very far off, kind of like the right system, when they went to the MPL, I don't kind of begrudge them making mistakes. I think making mistakes is fine. It's all about like how quickly you kind of react to those mistakes, how quickly you kind of like understand the problem. And I think honestly, it's some of the changes were out of the wheelhouse of the people at Wizards at the time, and they've tried to address that. They've gotten some new people and some different types of people in the thing. But like, I think it's really, really important for the Magic playing audience out there to realize that this is not a simple solution. There are a lot of mistakes that you can avoid, but getting it right is actually really, really tough.
Yeah, and I like, it gives us more context to understand how you would approach these problems when you put it the way that you did, right? Where we're not just talking about Wizards of the Coast as a company. Like, look, they're always going to look at demographics, right? They're always going to say, like, how many female identifying people play our game? Oh, it's a very low number. We'd like to expand that. What can we do to try to capture more of that audience? Why is that the case, right? And you start going on these searches to try to figure these things out. And those are very complex things that are hard to answer. But you do the best you can. But even within the context of, let's just call them people who like Magic, right? Like, regardless of demographic beyond that, well, is there room? What are the growth areas within that, right? And it seems to be that they have become convinced that the competitive scene is not a growth area, right?
I think
like, not that it's not valuable, but that it's not a place to focus their newly found energy, or however you want to put it.
Yeah, I think this might have been one of the unforced areas I think Wizards might have done, and this is getting a little bit into the critique of the whole thing. It's like you can't see every player as equal. Like, growth can be talked about in many ways. First, like, it's like number of players, right? And then you can have like types of players, and then you could have like revenue. These are all different ways of like approaching growth.
Okay.
And what competitive play allows you to do is like, it increases what we in kind of the digital game design industry called stickiness. Like, your likelihood to stay with this product from week to week, from day to day, or from month to month. And so having OP deepens your investment in Magic.
I see.
And deep engagers with a product are more likely to spend, advocate for the game, like all these things that are great for Magic as a whole.
I see.
And so when they went from kind of like deep to wide, and they said, hey, we're not going to deal with competitive players anymore, I was afraid that they were kind of not going to invest in the players that actually invested in them.
Right.
And so one of the things that I love about the new OP kind of like announcement is the tone that engaged invested players do have an outlet for their investment.
Okay.
Like there's a payout for their time and their kind of like dedication. It's not as much as the MPL dedication, and that's fine, because like MPL serves too thin a slice of the players.
Right.
And this one does not, and that's good. And this is, when we talk about later on about like how does limited fit, I think there's still some growth areas to how to kind of like turn those players from kind of like shallow engagement to extremely engaged. But I do think that this direction is so much better and feels so much better. It's like kind of on a psychic level, this OP system feels like the right direction, whereas the MPL one was kind of like intuitively not the right way to go.
Definitely. The things that come to mind when I hear you say this, especially about, I like how you framed it in terms of like almost like width and depth, right? Like if you said, well, we got 1 million new players, right? Great. What did they spend, right? Like, well, they bought 1 booster pack each, right? It's like, okay, that's probably a lot of money. That's probably pretty good, but they're not sticky. They're not deep, right? Where the hardcore and franchised, particularly competitive players, but there's other groups too that are similar. They're very deep. They spend a lot, but this is the part that comes up for me, obviously, as a content creator in Magic and somebody who cares a lot about this community and the game and all of that stuff. it's really hard. How do they know when something's working, right? Like they try to do it by linking it to some monetary thing, right? It's something that indicates how much money they're getting. But, the big eye-opening moment was when Star City shut down their content, right? It was like, if I'm sitting at Wizards, and by the way, I assume that they did think this. I'm not saying that they didn't, but if I'm there, I'm going like, they don't pay for that, right? Like if, Ari Lax writes an article that a lot of people read, Sam Black writes something, Wizards didn't, they're just like, hey, we're over here making cards, do what you want to do. And there's all these people engaging and interested and making it a lifestyle choice and telling other people about it. I mean, great example is like this podcast or whatever, right? Like, me and Ryan, me having picked up the game in 2008 or whatever again with Ryan and then us starting the podcast, that has to have had an impact over the years as far as like cultivating either new players or depth of the players that are there or keeping them engaged or whatever. But we don't work for Wizards. Like,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually that's a thing I think they're losing with their earlier announcement, like we're not subsidizing the pro lifestyle. Yeah. I think you don't need to make that statement. You can kind of like push in those directions, but like the problem is that like people knee-jerk kind of like look to the worst case scenario a lot of times. Like it's just very, very natural to kind of say, oh, if you say I'm not going to subsidize the pro lifestyle, I actually think that direction is okay. Like I don't think there's a problem with like saying we're not going to try and get players who can like live off the prize money that we're like. That doesn't mean that you can't live off Magic. In fact, right? Like this podcast is kind of a example of like how you can actually like content create and do that. And I think the signaling is really, really important. And actually, I think it was a problem with the signaling that Star City had too, where this is, hey, we're not going to like we're just going to fire everybody. Like I think they could have ratcheted back, and I think they could have framed their kind of like announcement in a certain way, such that they didn't alienate like a lot of their kind of like loyal players and loyal like content creators too, because I think who as a content creator is going to trust Star City as a platform anymore? Like I mean, I'm sure some people will, because they have added a lot to Magic, and I want to be very clear here. Like, but I'm using Star City as kind of like the most prominent example of kind of pulling back. But I mean, I do think there's a lot of these communication unforced errors where you need to massage the message a little bit more creatively, not because you're trying to change the message, but actually there's nuance in the decision making, and you've got to show that nuance. And I think, they probably Wizards probably burnt a lot of like kind of goodwill with their initial like move of like we're not going to do professional Magic anymore, because the OP system that they announced actually is like subsidizing some amount of kind of professionalism in dedicating to the game. Yeah,
totally, with the prize pools and the frequency of the tournaments and stuff, and that's only the first stage or whatever that we've got. So yeah, I think about that part a lot, about bridging the gap, because I know how corporations work, right? Corporations are usually, certain people have responsibilities. That's their area that they need to be responsible for. How do they measure responsibility? Usually they have metrics of some sort. It can be any number of things, from monetary to player base to interacting with the product, whatever it is, but their bosses will say, well, I want to know how well you're doing at this, right? Then that gets translated into budgets, and budgets are finite. And that is the circle of life for corporate, budget begets this, then you get your metrics, then you get your budget, then you do it again. And if you're really good, or if things are going well, those things are going up, including the budget and the metrics. And if not, then they're going down or they're getting cut. But it's hard, right, to say, like, you look at one decision, like, okay, let's cut OP, right? Let's say that they had just decided to completely slash the whole entire thing. which they didn't, but let's just say that they just said like all of it's gone, right? Even then it's difficult to tease out what you lose, because you could easily just say, well, we generated this much income, right? Because we had these tournaments, and we're just going to go without that income and put this budget that we had for that somewhere else where we think we can get more money out of it or more whatever. But, you know, that doesn't factor in losing people's dedication to this stuff, right? I remember when I first started, it was like, people told me that there was a pro tour. I was like, okay, that's great. There's a bigger world out there that I don't even know anything about. I'm at a local game store, right? There's a bigger world out there, and that makes me feel like I can dedicate some time to this. And I'm not a kid, right? I'm 30 years old, right? I'm not like spending time at the local game store just wasting time dinking around or whatever. Like, I'm trying to build something. There's something bigger for me, even if it's never actually been my explicit goal to get to that point. The fact that it was out there changed the way that I behaved with it, right? And the way that I interacted with that. And I feel like that type of thing is really tough to track down to a number, but it does come out in the wash on the big picture.
Yeah, I kind of want to give you a little bit of a kind of peek into how I think Wizards is thinking about this, because like from when they just had the paper game, or mostly the paper game, like MTGO actually made some money, but not a huge ton. But so paper was such a big piece. Paper is actually like really, really hard to get data from, because when someone buys a pack, it's actually really, really hard to tease out why they bought the pack and what's their buying behavior in general. Like, as in, like, you buy a pack, you know, some of these packs come from Walmart, some of these come from LGS, and some of these packs come from online, online. And it's actually hard to figure out what's the meaning behind why that person bought the pack. Is it a casual player? Is it a competitive player who's buying cards for their deck? Is it someone who's like a store who's like opening packs to sell singles? Like, there's so many different possibilities. And so I've heard from a lot of Wizards people, they actually worked in a very low information environment when it came to paper Magic for a long time, right? And along came Arena. Arena is a shiny new thing, but actually the big piece of what Arena gives Wizards is a lot of data. Okay, so when someone
data, right?
Oh, it's huge. It's like, let me tell you, the reason why there was an over-investment in Arena is Arena gave them such kind of like positive looking data that they felt like, hold on, this is where Magic is meant to go, right? So like, think of it this way. Every time someone installs Arena for the first time, they can tell, right? They can tell, like, this is creating a new player that didn't exist before. Yeah. That's like, before you didn't know if this booster is actually a new player or an old player. Right. So they go, wow, like, look how many new players we're getting into Arena. Then they actually can look at like how often people play. And so you say, oh, wow, like, we have so many players who play daily, so many players who play weekly, so many players who play monthly, because you can actually look at the metrics. All the metrics are like part of the game, like tracking that we call it. Like so when you have a digital game, you put little hooks where you actually kind of like pull out the data, and you can actually kind of like build these profiles of types of players who play daily, players who play monthly, etc., etc. People who play like certain queues versus certain other queues.
I mean, the perfect granular data about every player. It's a dream, right?
But the thing is, when you have like a world that has like great data versus a world that does not have a lot of good data, you start overcompensating or over-indexing for the data you have. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So they start investing in like MPL, the Mythic Championships that Arena was focused on. Like, everything was about Arena because Arena was showing good data and like understanding of like converting players from not, you know, from starting Arena to like being super dedicated. And so I can imagine a world, and this is my guess, is that they're getting all this new data in. They can show their executives and owners, like, look all the stuff that we're doing that's awesome. And then the people up top saying, okay, that's the thing that's showing growth and success. Yeah. Because we have data that proves it. Let's put more money into it. And so, but actually, over in paper, paper was like actually failing for different reasons, because paper actually didn't consider things like what are other types of ways people play Magic, and it wasn't until like there was like random focus on Commander, and I say random because I've talked to some Wizards people, and they basically said it was not until we started making kind of like Commander decks that we even realized that this format had the legs to actually be kind of like big and part of it. And now my worry is they're actually over-indexing that, like focusing on Commander and Casual is the thing that like the future of Magic is about. And actually all that means is that the competitive group has been underserved for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think if you start dedicating to that group of players, you're going to get actually a pretty rich vein of people who are like super dedicated, and dedication actually like creates more players. Because if I play and I want to be dedicated to the game, what am I going to do? I'm going to tell my friends to play so I can practice with them.
You're going to drag them in. Yeah.
Drag them in. It's right. Like you get more advocates. And that's actually the term that we use. Like people who advocate for the game and are hubs of their community. And actually, that's
I'm assuming
really,
those
really
people
important.
are extremely valuable to a company, right? Like
Absolutely. I mean, think of how many people love Magic and chat about it on Twitter. Like all those, I know not every like pro player is positive or everything like that, but so many of them create like players. Like Paolo probably has created tens of thousands of people dedicated to Magic.
Right.
And Luis has as well. Like yourself with LR and all the other stuff you do has as well. Like it really behooves like WotC to actually make sure that they're still creating those Paolos and Luises and Marshalls, because they there's a ripple effect that kind of creates communities and long-term dedication and kind of investment into the game. Yeah.
And, I feel like they do know that, right? Like I've talked to people at Wizards and they seem very aware of like influencer stuff. And, they have a person who works there, Jim, he's the influencer manager. Like they know what's up. They're not blind to that stuff, but I'll tell you, when those numbers start flying from arena, from growth areas where they haven't seen numbers like that yet, like you said, when the Commander stuff comes out with secret layers and stuff, where we know what we have here, but look over there, those are, areas where we can actually grow. It is just tough to keep people's focus on the bedrock, right? It's just, you take it for granted. You just say, we've got this whole competitive scene. We've got all these influencers. We've got these content creators, and that's just sort of churning away, doing its thing. But I'll tell you, you neglect that space at your own peril. I mean, because what I've seen is that they're in a growth period at Wizards for the past few years, ever since Arena came out, right? They're hitting these numbers on the quarterly reports that are just insane. And the pandemic brought a whole bunch of money to every hobby, to every interest, to every asset class. Like people, it's funny because being a part of multiple hobbies that like we're collecting is part of it. I feel like I'm at a cross section where it's like, everybody's like, wow, my old Magic cards went up so much in value. It's just crazy how expensive they are now. And then like, I'll talk to somebody who likes to collect watches and they're like, wow, all my watches. And then, somebody who just bought a house is like, my house just went up a bunch. It's like, yeah, you seen a trend here? What, into cars? Guess what? Your old car is worth a lot more than it used to be because of supply chain issues and because of all the money that got dumped on the economy here in the US, right? It's like everything is going up, right? It's not just that. And if you're Wizards, you're just like, hey, everything went up during this like 2-year stretch and we had barely an OP system in place. So that must not be important, right?
Yeah,
People couldn't even play with paper cards very much. And those are still, everything's going up. It's great. But I'll tell you, when things start to retract, if that happens, that's where you look to those foundational things, right? That's where you go, do we have a robust set of players who are deeply invested in our game and who continually bring people in to fight churn, right? Yes. All of these type of games have a percentage of players that will naturally roll off. And that's like the tax. If you can't if you can't bring in more people than you're losing, you'll start to see your game go downhill. And recently they've introduced new products that have been explosions so that it just covers up anything close to that. But it's, it's when things get tight that you really need to make sure that you've covered those bases appropriately, even if it's not really the exciting place to put your budget at the moment. And that's the kind of thing I worry about. And again, I go back to the Star City thing. That was very eye-opening, right? To see all of those content creators just kind of fingers got snapped and they dissipated. Now they've kind of some of them have started Patreons or YouTube channels or, working for other sites. But, there was a net loss there of engaged, great content creators who kind of are floating, and like, again, if I were Wizards, I would be that would really be eye-opening for me. And again, I assume it was too. I'm not assuming that they're just like, yeah, whatever, we don't care, go Arena. I think that they're very tuned into this stuff, but yeah.
I was definitely worried with their announcement of like not doing like pro level Magic. I was like, okay, this could be a real big defunding. I actually think this new OP system really has kind of like realigned what I think their dedication to it is. They know that this environment is important,
definitely,
which is great. And so like I feel it's not the perfect system, but I don't really care about that in some ways, because as long as you have the will and the goal of trying to make sure that this lives, they can iterate. There's a bunch of smart people working on the problem, and I think there's a long-term kind of like there. As we'll talk about, and Limited's position in this whole scheme, I am less confident about that piece actually.
Okay.
And I am worried about that piece a little bit. It's probably one of the bigger areas where I think there's a shortfall in the expectation of the audience and the needs of the audience. And what is being presented.
So we'll talk about that. I want to let me just ask you a really straightforward question. What do you think about the changes? Are you happy? Right. Were you relieved? Were you thrilled? Were you like, this is fine? Where'd you come down?
I am relieved. It actually doesn't fit my play style, so to speak, but personally, but I've been in the biz, I've been around, like every system does not have to revolve on how I interact, because like one of the big gaps that I see is like Grand Prix, and it's kind of like how I interacted with the system and how I like to interact. That being said, I think that it's great, the amount of money and events and some of the smart things that they've done was regionalize the organization. And the big piece of why that's really, really important is the Pro Tour or the Pro Tour system used to be a very top-down system. Wizards used to be able to like decide and control everything about it. The thing is, a lot of the smaller locales or the weirder locales, and I'll explain what I mean by that, like actually it didn't fit that well. So a good example is Canada. Canada is a extremely large country. I think it's the second largest country in the world, and people don't really realize that. And one of the big things is like East and West are very, very divided. Right? They're really, really hard to kind of like. And so the old system tried to nationalize like a lot of these things. So like, oh, Canada's one country, so we're gonna tell it that you're gonna have one nationals, and it was actually super expensive and super difficult to actually get to tournaments in Canada. And like now that you actually have a dedicated like manager of Canada that can run the system however they want to run it, like they have a system that's better for Canada specifically, right? And this is hopefully going to be true for other regions where, like you say, hey, our local scene like requires kind of like a lot of like WPN focused stuff, or our local scene wants Grand Prix level stuff, right? And the TOs can kind of like rejigger how they want that system to work.
Right.
I'm almost positive the early system is going to be a bit troublesome and people are going to be a bit lost. But the organization allows for a lot more flexibility on that level, which means that you can have better growth. You essentially are building the system for the region. And there'll be tweaks about how that region is organized, but I actually think that's a really, really good change. And overall, the amount of tournaments, the amount of like how worlds and the qualification difficulty. I think it's terrific. I actually think it's a really, really smart system, and kudos to the entire team that created.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part about the new system is the food pyramid that they put up, right? Where like it starts off at the bottom with the widest player base and then gets narrower and narrower. It goes up, basically like more exclusive events. But it's really straightforward. Like if I was at my local game store and somebody came in and said, I'm interested in starting to play some competitive tournaments. And they said, but I'm just like intimidated. I don't know how it works. I could say, I can tell you how it works. And it'll take me like 30 seconds. Like really, I can say, again, not every detail, but I can just say something like, you play around here, you qualify for a regional championship. If you do well there, you get to go to the Pro Tour. And if you do really well there, you get to play in the World Championship.
Yeah.
And it's of course, there's a lot of steps in between, but that's something that person can go, whoa. So there is actually a path for me to start in this local game store sitting across from you and end up at the World Championship someday? And the answer is, yeah, there is. Where before, not only was it too convoluted, like there's no way I could explain the different iterations of getting into the rivals and MPL and the gauntlets and the challenger and all that stuff. But on top of it, I couldn't genuinely look at somebody and say, here's what the path is. I would say, like, don't even bother. Like, like not that this person's likely to make it to the World Championship, but they're never making it in the MPL. Like that, you can't even spike into that. Like you had to win all the time,
It wasn't clear. And this is from my perspective, I'm a person who's dedicated to kind of like watching Magic, being part of that OP system. And I honestly not only couldn't explain it, I turned off because I just didn't care. Certain events just didn't matter, or
they didn't carry weight with you.
Yeah, it was just really, really hard to kind of like understand how they mattered. And obviously, the people who are playing it matter because there's thousands of dollars like on these matches, and these systems actually they had impact. Yeah, but they didn't have impact to the average viewer, and I think that's really, really important because you need to be able to see how you fit in that pyramid.
That's right. What were some of your favorite parts about the announcement? Like, what were the highlights for you where you thought, okay, they again, maybe you felt really relieved, like, okay, they still did this, or maybe there was some feature that you thought was really a standout.
Okay. So the two best parts are kind of towards the top for me. Mm-hmm. I think the Pro Tour setup is good. I think it's like having, the regional championship to Pro Tour distinction is good because the Pro Tour has cachet amongst the enfranchised players, right? Yeah. So thank God they went back to the name because I think there's a lot of value there. But also the prize pool and the kind of prestige that is connected to that all has been kind of restored, which is fantastic. And while there is less tournaments, I actually think there were almost too many Pro Tours at different stages of the system, and having 3 focused ones. I've heard that they're going to probably connect them to the set releases again. Thank God, because the worst thing is to have a stale format connected to that. The prize pool is fantastic, and actually the World Championship is a smart thing. I actually don't think that the kind of 16, 24, 32 person events were as fun to watch because you didn't have as much kind of interesting dynamics of what the format looked like. It was very, very inbred. You'd have these teams making such big percentages of the field. It's okay, so I'm seeing this matchup again and again and again. It really actually made for very poor viewing because there was such value for the players to work together. But then if they're working together, they make up such a big portion of the tournament itself. So therefore, there was only kind of 3 or 4 different kind of groups, and so therefore they naturally move towards very, very kind of stock meta games, which is a really, really bad thing as well. So the fact that the World Championship is now about 128 players, I think that's a really, really good number to kind of have a little bit of kind of some dark horses as well as teams work, which is great. And the fact that the steps are clear, as you said before.
Okay.
One of the big things I think they did right here, and it's kind of like it's funny, is the announcement itself. I think Wizards historically has had a lot of bad announcements and very convoluted ways of kind of like rolling out things.
Yeah.
This was great. They did the article, everyone got to read the article, then they had a video announcement later. Like this is it's really, really important. And the amount of times that they've kind of screwed up the announcement part of it really, really kind of like means that the fact that they got it right this time, it just was night and day.
Yeah, you know, they've gotten a reputation for announcing an announcement. You know, oh, we've got something to say today, and then you show up and they go, in June, we're going to be talking about this. And you're like, you know, and this one felt very like, here's what we're covering today. And there it is. Like we have all the, you know, when Huey went on with Blake to do the video presentation, they took questions from chat, you know, and, you know, it was very clear cut about what they were talking about, the scope of what was announced today, and then some of the stuff that wasn't. But it was, you weren't left going, what? It was like, okay, they're not talking about that today. But they covered a lot with the announcement. That was the key, right? Like if they just would have said, we are going to be doing OP in the next season, we don't have details yet of what it's going to look like, it would have been like, okay, but like, you know, I want some more meat on the bone. And here I felt like we got the whole meal, right? It was like, yes, there are some details that will come up later, but I mean, they really flesh this thing out, you know, where, I mean, you know, I don't want to go into detail on this part, but one of the things that they're doing to, the way that they're tracking people at the Pro Tour level to re-qualify for future events are called AMP or adjusted match points. And like Huey was able to answer questions about that. Right. Yes. What you need, what record you need to requalify, how adjusted match point work. It wasn't like we're going to have a system of requalification, but we don't know what it looks like. It was like, nope, this is here. This is how we're going to do it. Right. And they put plenty of food on the plate for us to chew on. Yeah, we'll come up with some stuff after, like, wait a minute, if I qualify in one region and then I move to another one, am I allowed? Okay, fine. There's some exceptions or details and stuff that we can nitpick at. But you know, they had a reputation for doing things that would, again, announce an announcement, and they didn't do that here. They really stuck the landing. And boy, it was really nice to have everybody happy for half a day, you know, just like it wasn't the normal.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, this is actually a little of a technical thing that I actually liked. The adjusted match points, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but one of the good things is that it makes every match matter for players. So there's going to be less concessions and IDs in the whole system. And I think that's actually really, really a very good benefit of that system. It's one of the things I liked that was new, and it was clear that they thought about. It's
such a big deal. I know that's, like you said, that's probably too in the weeds, but like I remember when I first started participating in it and then covering Magic tournaments, and it was just like, oh, he's going to scoop him. I'm like, what? Like, that is offensive to everything, because I came from watching sports, right? And I'm like, this is you can't purposely lose to somebody. Like, what are you doing? It's cheating. And they're like, no, it's fine. And you know, I remember the first time somebody's like, oh yeah, he's running interference for his buddies, or he's dream crushing. I'm just like, what the hell are we doing? You know, like there has to be incentives to win, you know, like that needs to be part of it. And it wasn't. What about some of the stuff that you didn't like? Like, was there anything out of the announcement where you were just like, you know, this was a miss, or I wouldn't have gone this direction, or anything like that?
I mean, there's two big gaps. I think one is the GP level system, and it's not the fact that like they couldn't do it. As I said before, there's a lot of flexibility to allow for the regional regional organizers to do this. But like, it's actually really, really good to have a big open event that's available to people in a region, because it like you want to be able to compete with some of the stars of the game without having to kind of like qualify, because there's going to be these people who like they're in the good area of their local tournaments, but they never win. Right. And those people will never actually ever get to experience what it is to play like a big event with a lot of stakes.
Right.
And I think that's unfortunate. Now, there's the belief that this will be a gap that will be filled by like tournament organizers there, and they probably will be for some regions. But I think I would love to have a little bit more intentionality on the part of Wizards to actually, excuse me, to actually kind of like create this layer of open big event like qualification events. Now, there doesn't have to be as many as Grand Prix. I think Grand Prix were like really, really kind of like lost leaders for Wizards for the long time. What that means is like they were there for kind of like growth, but not actually making money. And I think that was a problem. I think you could make them into profitable enterprises, but I think that you need to kind of like focus them a little bit more and probably have fewer of them and, you know, understand kind of like what makes a successful, like, as a big open event. And I think they'll still exist. I think they'll come, and maybe Wizards will want to roll out a Grand Prix system, you know, in the years to come once this system is rolling. But that was a bit of a disappointment. And also, I think the lack of teams. I think teams is like such a beloved piece of like OP. The fact that there was no kind of presence of teams like is a little bit sad. Again. That's a level that can be added later. This is not something that is like a deal breaker, but I do hope that they have a good plan for how to integrate teams. And it doesn't even have to be at the Pro Tour level. I think that's probably something that's actually really difficult to do. Sorry, when I talk about teams, I'm talking about like 3-person teams, you know, those kind of tournaments. I mean, you could always have like teams like Channel Fireball, where they're just working together. Those, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about those,
right?
Yeah, testing teams. I'm talking about those 3-person teams that you actually get to play with your buddies side by side. I mean, those are the things. And the really important thing about those is that they are events that people can come back to after not playing for a while. Because, like, let's say I've been playing all this time, and then there's a team event, and it's like, oh, here's 2 of my buddies that I love playing with back in the day, or just, you know, who don't play as much anymore, and I'm there to help get them back to speed.
Right.
And I think they actually like represent a really, really important way to kind of like re-engage players that hadn't played for a while.
Because, you know, sometimes that turns into 3 years.
Yeah.
Right? Of somebody being like, I'm not really playing that much. Okay, TBS is going to be there. I get to play with my friend. I'll go, you know, and you go. And then it's like 3 years of heavy engagement with the product again. It's like, I'm, you know, you've worked in other games and stuff, but that type of stuff is so valuable, right? I mean, I'm assuming most games would just absolutely murder to have access to that level of engagement. I mean, what, you know, if you take I don't know if the term average game really applies, but I mean, how much more sticky is Magic than a game, a regular game? Isn't it just a factor of a lot? Like,
oh yeah, it's infinite, and part of it is that Magic is a social game, and you'll hear the term social game kind of like in digital spaces, and it means something totally different. But like, the important thing about Magic is that you are playing with friends. In fact, I would say it's almost table stakes, because think about Magic as it is now. It is impossible as a person who wants to off the street and says, you know what, I want to play Magic. And then they go into a store and they say, hey, I want to play Magic. The chances that that person's actually going to actually continue playing Magic, it's really high. It's really low, because most people learn Magic from someone who plays Magic.
Right.
Have
to be taught.
You have to be taught, because it's so intricate. There are so many pieces. And on top of it all, the barrier to entry from a cost perspective, like how much money do I need to actually shell out to even start playing the game, is super high. I could buy an entire board game for the cost of, like, you know, playing a draft. Yeah, an event or something like that. And it's like, how do you justify that? You justify it because the dedication and the long-term, like, you know, value of being part of the Magic community is super high.
Right.
And so that's why the stickiness is really there, because like, one, the game's great. That's the first part that is really important. But 2, your friends are playing it, and they're playing it a lot. And that's really, really important too. And he's like, oh, okay, well, we can make this a weekly thing. You know, we can go out, like, have a beer, you know, get some like, you know, hot wings or something like that. We play some Magic every week. And I think that's really, really important. And it's just really, and the next step of that is like team events and events that actually get a lot of players together. And that's why Commander is such a big part of, a big pillar of Magic, because Magic, like Commander Magic is kind of like casual Magic distilled into its best form. It's like a big board game, which I love.
Yeah. You know, I've always, when it comes to Commander, my take on it's always been that it captures a core conceit of what most people view Magic as. And this goes back to the very beginning of when Magic first came out, which is the idea that you have your deck, right? Yep. That most people, when they think of Magic, don't think of like, well, every 3 months I need to come up with a new deck because something rotated out or a new set came out that, or, you know, that I no longer am basically either allowed to or incentivized to keep playing the same deck. So I need to do something completely different. But when Magic early came out, when those concepts of this like rolling over tournament cycle thing weren't really accepted or known yet, you know, you could have multiples, but you would have a deck of Magic cards. And when a new set came out, you looked at it as an opportunity to augment that deck. You could maybe replace a couple of cards or add a couple of cards and sort of keep building that. But you always had, this is my red-green deck, right? And then when a new cool red-green card came out, you're like, oh, sweet, that'll go right into my red-green deck that I've always had, that I have a name for, that I play for multiple years in a row, right, in a casual setting. And when it comes to Commander, it feels exactly that. This is my deck. I built it, right? This is the Commander that I chose because it represents what I like about Magic. And these are the cards that I chose to put in, and I'm invested in it. And, you know, if you sit down at a Commander game at like a GP or whatever, take a look at people's deck. They're not just, you know, using draft basic lands and a bunch of stock cards. Like, they pick the version and the, you know, the language. I mean, every single thing about the cards that they put in is indicative of what they love and what they want to express about themselves through Magic. And when new sets come out, they have that same mentality. It's not, well, a new set came out, therefore I'm going to throw away the old deck I had or sell it off or get rid of it. It's, how can I use these cards to augment my deck? And you can repeat that over multiple decks. You don't have to only own one, but that's, I think, a core way that people interact with the game, and Commander brings that to you, where the other formats don't. Limited doesn't, and certainly the rotating constructed ones don't. But you know why people love Modern so much? Because they have a deck. It's one deck. They, you know, and they get really good with it, and they tweak it, and they, you know, they know it, and they don't in Modern. Like, I guarantee if you could do a study, people do not jump around from deck to deck to deck, you know, monthly, right? It's much harder to get people to change decks at that point.
Oh yeah, no, and actually it brings up another key kind of, I would call it like a early indicator of something that Wizards might be trying. So I don't think it's an accident that the first format for constructed format for the PT is Pioneer. Pioneer is kind of like, for those who don't know, Pioneer is a format that like begins with, I think, Khans of Tarkir.
It starts with Return to Ravnica, I think.
Oh, Return to Ravnica.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and it has all those sets since then. So it's a non-rotating format like Modern, but it's like a bit later, and it doesn't have the fetch lands in that. Now, the important piece is that I think this may be an indication that Wizards may be moving away from rotating formats for some of their competitive play, for a couple of reasons. One, I think there is a perception of a very, very large barrier to entry to formats. As like you buy a deck and then, like, you know, 2 years or less than 2 years later, the deck is useless. And there's a small card pool. So it's kind of like you're playing in this very small sandbox, and then all your cards get invalidated. And that's something, experience that no one loves. Like, I think hardcore competitive players like rotation, but in general, most Magic players like their deck to maintain what it does. But the problem was Modern was getting increasingly expensive. Like, Modern decks cost $1,000 on a regular basis. And so while Modern is a more popular format than Pioneer right now, I think Pioneer kind of like sat in a, let's call it a happy space where the affordability of the decks are reasonable. I think you're talking about $200 to $300 right now, which is, I mean, granted, a lot of money. So I don't want to kind of like belittle the fact that this is still like,
but for a lifestyle hobby.
Yeah, for a lifestyle hobby, it's still like reasonable but expensive. But compared to standard, where your cards will get invalidated if you invest in them, and actually they had to ban things a lot because it was a small card pool. Like Pioneer may be the default, like provided that everyone can kind of get on board on the train and really like that format and play it a lot. And for those who do actually play Pioneer on Magic Online, it's a fun format. I actually think it's actually right now in a very healthy place, and there's a lot of different decks and a lot of different deck types. And essentially create a new Modern where the barrier to entry is lower. And I think that's actually again, this is me reading a little bit of the tea leaves.
Yeah.
But like it's you have to understand that Pioneer is such a weird format. It hadn't been supported at all, apart from some of the regional players tours that happened just before the beginning of the pandemic. And so like Pioneer was a format that actually didn't get a lot of support over the pandemic, and it's kind of a peculiar thing for the first big tournament out of the Pro Tour to be Pioneer, unless they actually intended for it to be a long-term thing.
Yeah.
And so I think actually this is going to be their foray into like creating a new Modern that has a lower barrier to entry.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that look, they're just going to have to do this once every 10 years, right? Like they made Modern a little over 10 years ago, and it was about as big as Pioneer is now. And it was way more open, way more fun. It wasn't as degenerate. You actually had creature-based decks. Like if you remember when Pioneer Modern came out, like Zoo was a deck. Like you don't see decks like that anymore. You know, now it feels more like how Legacy felt at the time when Modern came out. And that's not a coincidence. It has a similar card pool now. You know, you added 11 more years of cards, right? So, you know, and then they came out with Pioneer. It felt to me like they wanted to make Pioneer on Arena and make it kind of because they knew that they wouldn't go as far back as to make Modern on Arena, but that maybe they could figure out a way to backlog some amount of cards or sets to make Pioneer a thing. And then they decided to branch off and go to Historic and all this, you know, stuff that's outside of the scope of the conversation. But at any rate, yeah, it looks like that's going to happen. And I do want to stick though on the broader topic of formats for the competitive play, because I want to talk about limited, and you started to touch on it before, but I want to kind of take the reins off on you here. The two things I want to cover for this part of our conversation, TBS, are one, kind of where are you at with how they integrated limited into the upcoming organized play system for the next season, and where would you like it to be? You know, where do you think it should be? And then also I want you to tell us a little bit about what it was like historically. You said that you've interacted with OP basically since OP existed. And so you've seen how they've used limited in different ways, where it was heavily emphasized at some points and de-emphasized at others. And I kind of want you to give us your take on the historical part. So why don't we start with the first one, which is they have integrated limited into this. We talked about it with Luis last week on the show. What's your take on how they did it and where it should be in the current and ongoing OP?
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate, this is where limited is at right now. So, like the stores can actually have limited events that their regional championship qualifiers kind of feed into. So the store can make that choice. I actually think it's the store's choice. It's not like dictated by like DreamHack in the US case. Like they get to make that choice. The place that it's missing is actually at the regional championships. The regional championships itself does not have any limited. I actually think this is a little bit of a miss. I think that you can incorporate a little bit of limited to like not have this weird kind of like vacuum of limited at that level, because they actually committed to actually having limited at the Pro Tour and the World Championship. So it's great. 3 of the 4 of the levels of the pyramid have limited. Weirdly, the regional championships doesn't have it. I think it's for logistical reasons for the most part, because my guess is that it's very possible that they're looking at something between a 500 and a 700 person tournament at the regional championship level
for the US.
And if that's for the US, and they kind of have to look at the worst case scenario, and the US and the European systems probably have to look at those scenarios where that's a lot of people to be running boost draft for, right? And that would be the expectation. I don't think it's impossible, but that's a heavy load, and it's not just for the logistics of running the event. I mean, you have to have like tables set up in a certain way. You have to have a lot of judges. You have to give out the product. It takes a longer time because you have the drafting section, then the deck building section, and then, and generally you want to have two of those, so that there's a lot more time that you add. I do think it's worth it for them to examine a way of doing that. Maybe make it on day 2 only or something like that. So it's a smaller amount of players that are exposed to it, but make it part of the regional championship level. Also, my worry is with the stores being kind of given the option to run limited, you're probably not going to see as much limited run at that level either, because again, a lot of the logistics, of running a limited event on the store level are kind of like make it harder. One, you've got the deck building piece. 2, like you want shorter tournaments as a store owner, but so you can run them kind of like in the evening or in the morning, so you don't have to be there all day. These limited events generally take a longer time, especially if you have like sealed in the morning and draft at the top 8 or something else like that. Like it's like I worry that a lot of stores are just going to take the path of least resistance when they're running the regional championship qualifiers and not choose limited. I think some of the stores that like are dedicated bigger kind of like OP stores, they'll have like limited as one of the events they run. But the problem is I worry that there's not going to be enough of it. And I think limited is the gateway format for people who are like either coming to the game kind of like with less of a collection,
right?
Because it's really, really hard to kind of like, you have to pony up for $200-$300 for a constructed deck. So someone who's been playing for only a few months can't really play these events. Also, people who haven't been playing for a while, that's another barrier. I can't I have most of the cards, so but I'd rather play a limited one because I'd rather not have to keep up with all the constructed formats. And so players who are like less dedicated than myself, like they're just not going to want to like get on this kind of like, oh, I've got to get a construct deck, I've got to practice it. Again, I understand kind of like, why are we trying to cater to these type of people? But really, you just want to have as big a tent as possible, right? You want every type of player. And I hope they direct more help for these WPN tournament, these stores to basically have limited, either subsidized product, kind of like a very, very good judge program, so they can get judges to help with like running limited, because you need a few more judges to do that. And also kind of like make sure that it's important to the competitive players by having on the regional championship level. So I think if they address those 2 things and maybe have a couple Grand Prix level events that kind of like have limited, because I think that's the other piece that's missing, because there's no Grand Prix level events. There's no big limited events either. So there's no way that you can kind of like play it on a casual level,
right?
Or it's a casual as in open competitive level. And I think that's something that's a little missing. Again, they can be added. So I'm not like, I'm not super worried yet.
Okay. Does viewership factor? How much does that factor in for you? What we've seen anecdotally is that there's fewer viewers for limited than constructed in general, but also that those viewers tend to be very engaged. They love it. Like the people that love it really love it. And that number isn't a fraction, it's not like 1/10 of the viewership, right? It is lower though on average.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably right that limited is not as fun to watch unless you're watching the entire draft and portion. Like you need to see that, like, hopefully multiple drafters from like build their decks, like draft their decks. Then you have to see like, matches that kind of like of those players. So it's actually just logistically, it's a longer story to have to tell. You have to tell it over like 3 or 4 hours rather than kind of like bite-sized. Hey, I play, Tron. That person is playing Tron. I can just watch 30 minutes. I can watch one game of it and get something out of it, right? So that's the problem. Now, can you make it better? Absolutely. It requires a lot more effort and a little bit more dedication. The thing is, I think viewership is overrated as a metric to why, I think you want to have a reasonable threshold of viewership, but it's okay to have kind of formats that are less viewers, but like show a different aspect of Magic, because what you're trying to do with the coverage is to show that Magic contains multitudes, right? Mm-hmm. That's actually really, really important. And if you just go for constructed players, yes, you get those constructed players, but like the limited players say, okay, well, maybe Magic isn't for me, or someone who would be predisposed to playing Magic limited, feels that it's not for them, or I like playing draft and on Arena, and I never see that aspect of draft contained on competitive play, and that's bad. So I think don't worry about viewership as much. Worry about types of players that you get. And I think if you want to have both, you want to have some constructed and you want to have some limited. Now, do we need to improve our limited coverage? Probably. And I don't mean like the casters themselves, but how we tell that story. I think it needs a little bit more massaging. I know that the coverage team, when the Pro Tours were in like big swing, were trying a lot of different things, like trying like drafts from different perspectives. Like I think Rich Hagan really was trying to pioneer kind of like different ways of showing good limited. And I still think there's a lot of ideas there, but like for sure we need more limited on the coverage, but don't worry about the viewership as much. Okay.
And then to kind of wrap up our conversation, what was it like back in the day? I mean, there were like actual PTs, right, that were just limited?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, that was the default. I think probably for the first maybe 10 years of the PT. I'm just making up the number. It's like, it was a while. Every PT was a single format. So you'd have the standard PT, and then you have the extended one, which used to be the old kind of modern one, and then you'd have block constructed, and you'd have dedicated draft PTs.
God, that's insane.
Oh, like in fact, those were my favorite PTs to play, obviously, because draft is awesome, and why wouldn't you want to draft? But like, you would actually play 5 or 6 drafts, like and to get to the top 8.
So you just come in on day one draft, and then like, did they do multiple drafts a day? They had to, right?
Yeah, so usually they had a couple of like variations. Usually it was like two drafts per day. So to make top 8, it would be 5. It'd be 4 drafts, and then the top 8 itself would be a draft. So there'd be 5 drafts.
So sick.
There was a couple times where they did 5 drafts throughout the Swiss, but you had the deck overnight, as in you draft. And play 1 round, I think, and then day 2 you'd finish off the drafts, just because logistically it was a long day to have to do kind of like 3 in 1. But I think the greatest part of those is that, like, I think limited is actually a little bit more skill testing for the stuff that is really interesting. And what I mean by that is constructed is really, really rewards people who dedicate a lot of thought about kind of what the opponent is doing on a meta level, as in like what's their game strategy or how are they sideboarding. And a lot of that stuff is quite cerebral, as in it happens like at the deck building level, right? And it happens like off camera. And that's a really, really like important skill. Some of the best players of Magic, like Brad Nelson and things like that, like really excel at that. But actually, it's not actually, you don't see it. You don't really see kind of like that, kind of like what's the 15th sideboard card, or what's card number 60. In limited, all the skill stuff kind of happens on the table. Yeah. Because there's so much combat and so much kind of like bluffing and counterattacking and do I press, or do I kind of like turtle up and go defensive, happens on the board itself. And incremental advantages like card advantage and kind of like tempo advantage matter more, and you get to see them kind of like on a turn by turn basis. That's why I think limited gameplay, if you're tuned in, is actually more interesting, because like For constructed, you're just trying to do the same thing over and over again. That's the optimal. It's like, I hope I do the same turn 1, same turn 2, same turn 3, because that's how you should build.
That's
a deck.
the goal. Yeah,
that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
And limited, actually, you're trying to kind of like read what your opponent is trying to do and react to that, as well as like forge your own game plan. But there's so much kind of like role shifting in limited. Anyway.
Well, and that's only in the gameplay, because you were also talking
right.
about constructing your deck, and that happens off camera, but that doesn't happen off camera in limited. You're effectively doing that during the draft portion, which we get to actually show. And there's that time crunch, right? Yes. There's like, you need to make a decision right here, right now. Everybody's watching. Somebody's ready to pass the next pack over to you. And that adds a totally different element. I mean, imagine if somebody's putting together a constructed deck and they're like, okay, guys, we need to make a sideboard. Okay, you have 15 minutes, go. It's like, what? You know, like all of a sudden you have to really like start cutting stuff and, okay, well, what's the most important thing? And it really kind of distills it down, you know, like we get in the draft portion where it's like 30 seconds, make your pick, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously really advocate. I wish there still was limited only Pro Tours. To toot my own horn, my only Pro Tour top 8 is actually in booster draft, and like, it was playing high level draft where every draft matters is like, it's wonderful, and also it's very, very fulfilling. And I hope I don't think they can go back to that, unfortunately.
Do you think they should? I'm asking you not from what you want, but you know, like if you were in the seat over there, would that be on your menu? Because it doesn't seem to be the flavor of the month.
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't make it as part of the Pro Tour.
I don't think I would either, even though I'd really love to see it.
Yeah. I do think there is a place for big money or big value kind of like limited events. I honestly
doesn't have to be a Pro Tour, right? Like,
does not have to be a Pro Tour. In fact, like I was suggesting that maybe every set they should just have this big pre-release kind of level Grand Prix every set.
An open high level tournament that was limited only.
Yeah, it's basically just the introduction of that set, and then people get to play it, and you kind of like get a feel for all the themes. Because I think the problem is if you don't actually make limited important, a lot of the themes out of sets don't even see any play. I mean, like
totally. Who
would know that ninjas is important to Kamigawa unless you actually played limited? Because there's no ninja deck out there.
I mean, a good example would be the dungeon deck too from AFR. Yeah. Like they tweaked it for alchemy and made it into a thing, so now people saw it because it won the PT. But before that, it was a constructed flop. Like nobody played those cards. Yeah.
Right. And really, you know, I know they put a lot of effort into making sure that the limited environment is good. I mean, in fact, it's probably one of the best things they're good at. Like,
they're really good at it now. Yeah.
Yeah. Why not highlight the fact that you actually put a lot of effort into it? It's really fun. Granted, it might not be the best viewing kind of experience, but it's probably one of the best play experiences. And so let's do that. Also, it has all the benefits of people who just started the game or people who aren't as dedicated to the game can play the game at a level that like can kind of like jump them into competitive Magic, which I think is super important. And it's probably the biggest thing that limited gives Magic is like a easier on-ramp into dedicating more time to Magic. And so they shouldn't lose that. And it's actually probably one of the things that Magic has a competitive advantage over its other games. Is like its limited is so good.
One last question for fun. They did some wild limited events, right? Like Two-Headed Giant Pro Tour, like that's crazy. But the one that always comes up for me were the like Rochester drafts, right? These are the ones I'm thinking of, right? Yeah. Where like it's face up drafting or whatever. I mean,
yeah. So I'll quickly explain Rochester draft to people so they understand. So basically, Rochester draft is boosters get opened up one at a time. Okay, so player A like opens up the booster that lays out the 14 or 15 cards, and they take one card, and the next person face up. Everyone gets to see what everyone else is drafting. They take another card, and it goes to player 8. player 8 takes 2 cards, and then kind of like it goes back around again. The reason why this was such a great format is that one of the pieces about booster draft that a lot of people complain about is like being lucky or unlucky based on like not understanding what your like table mates are doing. Right? It's like, oh, you know, the person to the right of me was drafting white and I was drafting white, so I got kind of like hosed. And that sucks, right? Like, whatever. I mean, I don't know if that's a legitimate complaint, but it's a very common complaint. Yes. and what Rochester draft is like, it really kind of like made you kind of understand what's the power level of the entire draft, because you can see all the cards that go, and you can actually like do things like draft sideboard cards against particular players, because you say, oh wow, like everyone's drafting a flyer, so I'm gonna get the wing snare or something like that. Like you can do things like where the drafts can be very intentional. It's like, hold on, it's like I know that there's these like bomb enchantments or artifacts, and I can like get a disenchant at the right time, and like values change based on information of everything.
This sounds really hard, by the way.
I'm well past my prime now, but at my prime, I wouldn't be able to get with like of the playable 23 or 24 cards that people play in their decks, I'd probably be able to get 20 of them and remember them for every player. So you know,
oh my God.
And honestly, I was not like, there were players who were way better than me, but like at the time, you know, of my greatest power is like I had the memory for this kind of game, and I understood how to kind of like one thing that's really good with Rochester draft. You can kind of like understand what cards are being bounced off the wheel, or what cards are like you can kind of counter draft and actually know that you're taking a card from someone else and they will have nothing to take. So maybe they'll take a sub card and then you'll actually get a card off the wheel. Again, counter drafting is, you know, dubious at best in a lot of cases, but when you know you're actually targeting certain players, it actually becomes a little bit more useful. Anyway, now this format isn't everyone's cup of tea. There's a lot of memory, it's a lot of skill, and there's a lot of kind of like, and the gameplay itself. I know if you have pump spells in your deck, so I can actually, like, if I remember well enough, I can actually say, oh, hold on, you don't have a giant growth in your hand because you didn't draft it, so I can like attack with impunity and things like that. Or I know you have one Terra in your deck, or like Doomblade.
Yeah.
So, hold on, I'm gonna like bait out the Doomblade because you think probably this is the card that you need to Doomblade right now, and actually I have this bomb that comes out of there. That like information is power in that
crazy
in that format, and I actually think it's actually almost better, but it's extreme. The draft takes way longer. I mean, drafting takes probably almost an hour to actually distribute the draft, right? And most people don't have the stomach for that kind of memory game.
No,
like,
I mean, that does not, I will say it doesn't sound fun. No, I'm not saying it doesn't sound bad. I would be interested in doing it, but I don't think that by the time I was done with the Rochester draft, I was like, you know, I had a really good time. I would be like, wow, that was intense, you know, like, and again, not that I wouldn't enjoy it, but there's something about just opening packs and slamming cards and seeing what happens that has like a fun element to it that this seems to be missing a little bit.
Oh, like Rochester draft, especially Team Rochester draft. These are the Cadillacs of Magic. I mean, to take a little quote from a movie. It's like these are really, so really
funny. It's like, also just funny to look back at how much, like, in the world of marketing, let's call it, right, where like everything's a product, even the draft itself being put onto coverage is like a marketing, you know, thing. The idea of putting something like that in front of a bunch of people, I don't think it would fly.
It's actually better for coverage. This is the weird thing.
Really?
Because the entire draft is visible. No, but the entire draft is visible. So there's not kind of like I get to see it from one person's perspective. You actually get to see the entire thing. Granted, again,
I just feel like that kills the tension. Like, it's like, oh, okay, well, you know, not that any of us can figure it out, but this is going to go here, that's going to go there, that's going to go there, that's going to, you know, and like you get to watch it happen, but it's like, I don't know. It kind of reminds me of like chess or whatever, where like I've never found chess interesting because I just can't stand games that have perfect information, where I just feel like, well, okay, I could sit here and figure out as much as I could figure out and then do the thing. But like, I can't really bluff you. I can't really, like, there's some little bit of trickery I can do, but like, once you know what all my moves are, you could figure out and I could figure it out. I'd rather just go to Starbucks and have a chat. Like, that just sounds like a lot of work, you know, like I don't want to do that. But
you had to be there.
Definitely. And you know, you're not alone. I mean, BDM talks like this. Huey says it was the best. Like this really does, you know, in many ways, people say that this is the pinnacle of skill level for Magic is Rochester absolutely. Drafting. So yeah, well, I wouldn't get my hopes up for that, but I do have my hopes up for everything else. Yeah, I think we're going in a good direction, and hopefully we'll get a lot more limited. TBS, thanks for coming on, and also thanks for giving us such insight. Man, you really do see both sides of the fence on this one.
Oh, I mean, look, Magic is responsible for almost everything in my life apart from my family. Like it's like everything professionally, everything like my social, my hobbies. Like I love Magic and every level of it. And being in the game industry, I realize how good a product, like how good a game Magic is. Magic, I still unreservedly say, is the best game. And I still want to be a part of it, and I still will try and be a part of it for as long as it's getting made, and there's still events for me to turn up to.
Are you going to battle? Are you going to be we see at the PT or?
I mean, I'll try. I mean, I have two
I know you got the
kids.
Little ones, yeah.
I got the little ones, but like, let me tell you, the OP announcement, I was trying to figure out, it's like, okay, what can I possibly get away with my wife? It's like, I mean, she's very supportive. Like, you know, she understands that games are a really big piece of it, and you know, I have a lot of like friends and social kind of connections there. But still, there's limits to her patience when it comes to like having to take care of the kids by herself.
Yeah, of course. She yeah, that sounds like tough. All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you out there. Where can people find you on social media or anything that you've got going on that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, no, I mean, the easiest place to get me is on Twitter. I'm at TBS dash written out DASH. And I have a couple like irons in the fire when it comes to content. So I'll be trying to do that. I know I come onto the LR podcast also to do the retro set reviews. I think we have one coming up.
We do
pretty soon. So like look out for that. And but if you just want to interact with me, please just send me a message on Twitter. Cool.
Thanks again, TBS, for coming on. We really appreciate it. Or at least I do. I don't know if Luis does. You'll have to ask him, but
I mean, I have no sympathy for him lounging in the Bahamas.
Yeah. So he says he's working. I'm like, yeah, right. You're on the beach.
I mean, you don't have to go to the Bahamas to work.
That's right.
The pandemic has shown us that we don't actually have to go anywhere.
That's right. We'll have to clue him in when he gets back. If you want to find me on social media, Marshall_LR. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. And if you want to visit our sponsors, it's channelfireball.com and ftx.com outside the U.S., ftx.us within it. We thank them for their support of the show. We really do appreciate that as well. Yeah, that's going to do it for this show. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then. TBS sign-off time. Okay. What's your favorite type of pan in the kitchen? What do you use the most? You a cast iron guy? You a wok guy? What do you use?
No, I mean... It's between the wok and the cast iron.
Oh, I just nailed the top two. Look at that.
Yeah, no. I mean, the thing is, you want like something that actually kind of like adds flavor to the dish itself, and almost intentionally, a cast iron gets better as you use it.
That's right, and that's true for a wok as well.
Yeah, it's true for a wok as well. I think a cast iron is like more flexible, as in there's more different types of foods that you can make with a cast iron. But I mean, obviously a wok, you know, like I do make a reasonable amount of Asian food, and like it's really like doing things like stir fries and kind of like on a regular basis, like those kind of dinners, like means that the wok gets used a lot too. But I mean, let me tell you, get a wok, use it as much as you can. Make sure it's like really like blackened with all the seasoning that you've done with it, because like it gets better.
It really does, and both of those can be quite nonstick if you dedicate yourself to.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, please take care of them. Make sure you oil them every time. So I think someone in the chat kind of like said kitchen resources. That might be the next content creation thing to do.
Oh, is that one of the irons in the fire? I like it.
Yeah, maybe we'll do kitchen resources. Just so you have your watch channel. I can have my my cooking channel that talks about cast iron pans and drafting at the same time.
Sounds good.